Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be with you. As usual, there's so many things happening at once in the Middle East with the Israel-Palestine situation and many other related issues in the region. So I'll give you my uh, key things that I think are important that you should know about, and I'm happy to answer any questions or discuss any of these points in more detail if you'd like. There has been a continuation broadly of the Israeli military operation in Gaza. The attacks have increased. They're intense from the air, from the sea, on land. They're especially intense in the south, and there's continued attacks against North Gaza and notices to the population to leave, and many of them have left and tried to go to the south. So it's a situation that has essentially now seen something like 85% of the population, about 1.8 million people in Gaza, have now been displaced. Uh, 85%. And many of the areas to which they were told to go, safe places, are not safe places because they've been attacked there as well. And so the bad situation keeps getting worse and worse and worse. The siege on food, water, medicine, etc., is pretty much still in place, except for this new humanitarian aid foundation process that was launched with U.S. Israeli support and funding and backing. It's still a little bit hazy and shady, not shady, but it's not. There's a lot of things that are not well known about it. But it has received universal rejection from the international official aid and human rights communities, who say that this attempt to distribute food is not adhering to established principles of being fair and universal and impartial, etc. But it's still going ahead. The interpretation of those who support it in Israel and the US is that it is starting to provide some aid to some people. But those numbers are very small. I don't have the exact figure, but the actual number of families that are going to these distribution places and actually getting boxes of food and things and taking them home is, I don't know the exact figure, but it can't be more than around 5 or 10% of the population of Gaza. And it's also extremely dangerous. Several hundred people have been killed in these distribution spots, partly by just the masses of people running to get the food, stampedes, and then shooting by the Israeli government, which has been verified now that it was the Israeli government that did the shooting. The Israeli government says it was shooting because there was disorder. So there's huge lack of specificity and details, verifiable details about what exactly is going on in these distribution points. The people who are running this operation are hired mercenary guards, they call them, some with American military training, others from other places. And they are unable to really control the masses of hundreds of thousands of people who are starving, and they hear there's food at this place, and some of them walk for 3-4 hours to get there in the sun. That the whole thing is just terribly unclear in terms of its logistics and its fundamental basic human value. It is suggested to be a humanitarian process that helps feed hungry people. The reality is that it's feeding very few hungry people. Many are dying. Many more are being dehumanized by this process. And it is the way that the Israeli government, with the direct involvement of the American government, is trying to evade the established principles of humanitarian aid that have been worked out over the last 75 years since World War II. how to deliver aid fairly and equitably, etc. So this process of they say they're going to open some more of these stations. Palestinians broadly feel this is a way to lure people who are starving and their babies are dying, to lure them to go to certain areas where the Israeli government would try to keep pushing them to the borders, so that at some point they get so desperate that they say, look, let me out of here, and they go to Egypt or somewhere. All of this is speculation. The Israelis will tell you something, the Americans will tell you something, the Europeans, the UN, everybody will tell you something. It's very, very difficult to get a 100% accurate picture. You get that in some cases after some of the first shootings that happened, people died. Some media, some UN agencies went in and did little forensic studies and were able to verify that the shooting was primarily from Israeli sources. The Israelis will tell you they were shooting because people were getting out of hand and they were acting suspiciously. People will come up with all kinds of explanations in this kind of situation, which, remember, the UN has said is a plausible genocide. And it's just such an extreme case of political pressure by one powerful side against another side, the Palestinians, which is pretty helpless on the ground, mostly civilians. So it's hard even to talk about this situation with any clarity, because virtually every sentence one uses to describe this situation uh, will be contested by somebody else. The antidote to all this on the humanitarian side is to let the UN continue delivering humanitarian aid in the way it knows how to do, which it has done for half a century, very efficiently, very fairly, very equitably. The Israelis don't want this. They don't want the UN to be involved. They don't want a lot of private NGOs to be involved. They seem to be using the siege that they've laid on Gaza now for about 3 months almost, for no food, no water, no medicine. A trickle has come in recently only, but the vast majority of people in Gaza are desperate. The death toll is estimated to be over 200,000. And again, these figures, choose what you want, 150 or 250. There's all kinds of ways that they calculate these. And the number of expected deaths now is a new figure that people have started to look at. Given the hunger, given the disease, the lack of medicine, the hot summer months, the disease is spread by polluted water, lack of water. Maybe 400,000 are going to die. So I think we've gotten to a point where the statistics become pretty meaningless because it's the gravity of the situation which the Israelis have created since the attack on October 7, which sparked this latest phase. But this is really the latest phase. You have to understand this. You have to see it as a part of a conflict that's gone on for decades and decades and decades. It's very difficult to just start with October 7 or the next week when the Israelis attacked. So this is one of the problems with this kind of politicized conflict. Um, and it's a very politicized conflict, and you get people on both sides arguing their cases. If you try to understand what's going on, you have to understand the legacy of the conflict, the whole conflict. And I tell people you have to go back to the very beginning, which is 1917, when the British approved the Zionist request to support their plan to have a homeland or a state for Jewish people in Europe to escape the persecution of the Russians and others. And so it's really in 1917 that this started, and it's brought us up to this day. You can take any point along that line if you want to discuss it, but we don't have time to do that now. So I just give you this suggestion that as you follow this situation, as you read the statistics, you hear the stories, you're going to hear conflicting stories from both sides, and you can get credible information once you identify a source that has been on the ground, has looked at data that's available, looked at statistics, looked at evidence that's available, talked to all sides, the Israelis, the Palestinians, the UN, other people who are there, NGOs who are there, few NGOs who are there. So this is a hazardous uh, task to try to explain what has happened. But what's to me more important right now than the just updating you on what's happened in the last couple of weeks is the spurt in political or diplomatic action. There are things happening now that haven't happened much or ever before. For instance, you've got European countries, 5 European countries, or four in Canada, or three, Canada, Australia, and 3 European countries, suddenly imposed sanctions on two Israeli government ministers, and the sanctions are that these are the two far-right, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and there's sanctions on them that they can't travel, their assets will be held, whatever. What sanctions normally do. Most of the sanctions that have been imposed by most countries around the world have not been very effective. Sanctions busting is a very successful business all around the world. The Israelis do it, the Hamas does it, the Iranians do it, the Russians. Anybody who's been sanctioned knows how to get around the sanctions. So they're really a political expression of discontent more than a practical way to try to force anybody. But for Europeans and some Western countries to actually start sanctioning Israeli elected members of Congress and ministers in the government is a symbolic act. It's a symbolic act that isn't going to make a huge dent in the negotiations or the situation on the ground, but it may be a harbinger of things to come, possibly. Mainly that the Western world, or parts of the Western world, or parts of officialdom in the Western world, because ordinary citizens in Western countries have long ago expressed their majority desire for a ceasefire, return of the hostages, return of prisoners, and a negotiated permanent resolution. That's clearly the will of the majority of people across most of the Western countries, including the US. But the governments have been much slower to do this. So governments are starting to speak out about these issues. The other thing that's significant is you had this boat, this humanitarian aid boat, which got a lot of publicity because of the Swedish young lady, Greta, forget her last name, and one or two other. And there was a European member of parliament from France of Palestinian origin, but she's a French citizen. She was on the boat. So they got some more publicity than usual. And what happened is the same thing has happened last time they had a flotilla like this. The Israelis gave it warning and then boarded the boat, prevented it from going to reach Gaza, and took the people who were, I think, 14 people or something. They expelled some of them, deported them. Others refused to be deported. They'll probably go to jail briefly, but they'll be deported eventually. That the actual process of bringing humanitarian aid and food on one ship to Gaza is not the main important thing here. The main important thing here is that international civil society is increasingly looking for ways to express its support for an end to this conflict and a resolution between the Palestinians and the Israelis that lets both sides live in equal justice and security. And the attempts to launch the boat trip, humanitarian boat trip, is one. Another one is this Great March for Gaza, which is happening right now. Started in Tunisia. They went across Libya on foot and car, and now they're going across Egypt. They hope to get to Gaza in a few days. They're also not going to be allowed into Gaza, obviously, but it's the expression of popular support for an end to the conflict that's important. And that's important not because it's going to end the conflict. It's important because it will probably mobilize a lot more people who will become more aware of what the situation is in Gaza, how terrible it is, the siege and the lack of food and medicine, etc., and the bombardments and killing, everything. But this kind of action raises awareness more and more in the Western world, especially. In the global South, it's pretty well known. It has good coverage, but in Europe, North America, Australia, they don't see all the details of the terrible things that Palestinians are suffering. And this kind of action has to be understood as one of the four battles that are taking place in Gaza. You have the military battle on the ground, which the Israelis dominate because they're so much stronger, especially with their full American and European and British support. You have the political battle that's being waged, like at the UN and other places, but that gets nowhere because of the US veto. Then you have the ideas or propaganda battle that is waged in the media and other places, advertisements. And that's a battle where the pro-Palestine voices are increasingly able to respond to and match the pro-Israel voices, which have always dominated the airwaves and the public arena. And now you have a fourth contest taking place, which is again quite historic, which is reflected in these two little episodes of the flotilla, the boat, and now this march across Gaza. There's other similar things that are going to happen, that are being launched and planned to have civil society, ordinary people, individuals, institutions, organizations, all kinds of people who are not government officials, not military people, saying we don't want this war to continue. We want it to be resolved peacefully, and we want the underlying conflict between Israel and Palestine to be resolved through peaceful negotiations in a way that gives the Israelis and the Palestinians their equal rights simultaneously within the land of Palestine. How that is done is for the Israelis and Palestinians to decide in their negotiations, which are not happening now, are not going to happen anytime soon. But the hope, my hope certainly, and I've spent my whole life working on for this, is that at some point the Israelis and the Palestinians have already reached this point where they realize you can't solve this militarily. You have to solve this conflict with political, diplomatic negotiations. And any negotiations have to meet the fundamental rights of both sides. So both sides have to make concessions. And in theory, you could reach a situation like happened in South Africa, where what seemed to be an implacable, unresolvable situation was resolved peacefully through negotiations that allowed both sides to live a decent, normal life. Northern Ireland, similar in other places. So also, Vietnam, Afghanistan, where the U.S. was involved, these were resolved through negotiations ultimately when it became clear that war wasn't going to solve them. Even if you're the strongest army in the world, which the U.S. was and is, it's not going to solve the problem. And now there's been so much human suffering in Gaza that the hundreds of thousands of young men and women in Gaza will want to keep the political battle going to gain their rights. But the significance now is that we have the fourth battle now that has been really launched figuratively with the Armada and the march from Tunisia to Gaza on land. And this is a sign that civil society is not just expressing its support for peace in the region and ending the attack on Gaza, on the siege, but the significance of this, I believe, is that it will start to put pressure on the governments in the Western world, who are the only ones who have the power to force Israel to stop its assault, accept the full ceasefire, accept both sides accepting to exchange prisoners and hostages, and only by big time support for governments in the West, especially the US, only then can you see the Israelis accepting a full ceasefire, which they refuse to do now. They refuse to accept. They say 60 days so they can get their hostages, but then they want to keep attacking. And this is important because those of us old enough to remember the 1960s and 70s and Vietnam and things like that, that these kind of actions, I don't know if some of you will remember the Berrigan brothers who threw pig's blood on draft board files. It was a symbolic, dramatic act. It was theater in many respects. And that act itself didn't end the Vietnam War. But what it did, and hundreds of other acts that people carry out peacefully, like the flotilla, like the march, are designed to politicize and mobilize and organize people in those Western societies, especially, who then will put pressure on the government to change its policies that can then end the war. So what we're seeing, I believe, in the last couple of weeks has been really quite significant historically, with the Europeans taking some diplomatic small steps to pressure the Israelis. The Hamas, in the meantime, has not been making much noise. They did repeat that they're willing to negotiate and have a full exchange of prisoners and hostages, but they've said that before. There's nothing new there. The Arab world has been remarkably silent and passive, which is a great puzzle for most of us in the Arab world. And the media in the Western world, I believe, has also started to reflect the shift that I mentioned, and I'll end with this, that the mainstream media in Europe and North America and other places has started to talk more about the suffering of the Palestinians, the crimes that Israel has created, in terms of, for instance, shooting the people going to get food. These kinds of things are becoming reported more frequently than before in the mainstream press. They've always been reported in social media and the progressive independent media, but the mainstream press has generally stayed away from reporting that is critical of Israel or the U.S. supply of weapons and support for Israel. Now the mainstream media is again starting to point out some of these facts. I believe this reflects their awareness that uh, they could be culpable of complicity in a genocide. If this situation doesn't change, at some point, we don't know when that is, you might get people taking the mainstream media, CBS and New York Times and stuff, taking them to court for being complicit in a genocide. And the genocide law, the genocide rules of the convention say that once a genocide is underway, everybody in the world, everybody, no exception, government, people, companies, are obligated by law to not help the genocide. Now, again, the Israelis and American senators will say this is not a genocide. They can debate that forever. Once the highest judicial authority of the world, which is the International Court of Justice, says this is a plausible genocide, and all the leading international human rights groups say the same thing, including some Israeli ones, then it's pretty clear that this is genocidal, or at least the war crimes taking place here. And this is a turning point potentially down the road. It doesn't seem to budge the Israeli government for now. It doesn't force Hamas to make any more concessions. They've made all the concessions they feel that they can make. So we're at this delicate moment where more suffering is going to happen, and more pressure is going to be applied on the Israeli government by whoever can do it. And I forgot one last point. There was a report yesterday that Trump called Netanyahu and told him, stop this war completely, end this war quickly, immediately. We don't know how accurate that is. It was in the Israeli and the American press. And I tend to be cautious about things like that, because the Israeli and the American press, when they report on Palestine, are not fully accurate and objective and impartial. They tend to reflect the thinking of their governments, and their governments are involved in the genocide. So we have to be careful about that. But it's possible that the American government under Trump, whom I'm very critical of for most of what he does, but if he's trying to pressure Israel to stop the war and reach an agreement, because he wants to make an agreement, Trump wants to make an agreement with Iran, which is far more important to the long-term well-being of the U.S. economy and its political influence in the region. If the war in Gaza is impeding Trump's ability to achieve a negotiated agreement with Iran, this is pretty significant, and it could be the case. I say could because we don't have any evidence yet. We just have to wait. But keep your eye on that. and listen to the alternative sources of media or watch them. That will give you more insights into the situation than you'll get from the mainstream media or in Israel or the US, and also from government officials. So let me stop there. I'm sorry that was probably a bit longer than I intended, but I thought I'd just point out to you again some of the key things that I think are happening that are significant.
Great, thank you, Rami. I'm going to call on Jeff to comment first, and then we can open to Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Cole. Thanks, Rami. As you suggested at the end of your presentation, besides the genocide and destruction of Palestinian existence and national aspirations, Israel's other strategic priority in the Middle East is the weakening or hopefully regime change from their point of view in Iran. Iran is the only major strategic adversary that remains for Israel in the Middle East. And as you said, the U.S. has been negotiating some version of an agreement with Iran on its nuclear program. And Israel and its lobby and supporters in the United States are adamantly opposed to any agreement that the U.S. may make with Iran. And they are agitating constantly to put unacceptable demands on the table toward Iran, not because they really think they can be achieved, but they want to sort of just torpedo any real prospect for a peaceful resolution. And in this connection, there are some, very worrying developments just in the last few hours. The next scheduled meeting to negotiate seems to have been put off. And meanwhile, there are reports that the U.S. has been ordering the evacuation of civilians and non-essential personnel from its embassies in the Middle East and its military bases around the Middle East. Now, whether this is in preparation for a war or a bluff or a threat, we don't know. But I just would remind you that Israel knows well that it cannot destroy Iran on its own. It can damage the country, it can cause some problems, but it can't really win a decisive war against Iran. And their strategic aim is to do something to get the U.S. involved in a war against Iran. And I guess it's important for us to understand that I think it's doubtful that the U.S. can win a decisive war with Iran. It has assets around the Middle East that are under threat by Iranian retaliation. And as a reminder, the U.S. Was forced to make a truce with Yemen, which is a microscopic power compared to Iran, because it was not succeeding militarily and was a great strain to our military forces. So the U.S. cannot destroy Iran quickly or easily. And if we got into a war with Iran, it would be a long and protracted struggle whose outcome is doubtful. So it's very risky for the U.S. To attack Iran, not because they don't want to, but because they probably can't succeed. So we need to watch this very carefully. This is, we're approaching what may be a really decisive strategic moment in these negotiations, and nobody really knows where it's going to end. But
yeah, and one of the things is fascinating is that the key person in this right now is obviously President Trump. And nobody in the world has any idea of what Trump really is aiming for, what he'll settle for, what he'll propose. He's not a strategic thinker. He's not a great expert on the Middle East. He doesn't know these societies. He's very good at making deals to make money for him and his family and his colleagues and his countrymen and his woman and American businesses and all that. But this is fascinating because we're seeing the blowback against the U.S. And Israel for decades and decades of their policies that have demeaned Middle Easterners and dehumanized them and destroyed their societies, endless wars in Lebanon and other places in Syria. And we're seeing now pushback by a country, Iran, which is, has significant capabilities technically and otherwise. There was a report 2 days ago that they were able to infiltrate the Israeli intelligence system and get secret files about Israel's nuclear industry. It's not clear yet what these files are. They haven't provided details. There is a danger of a war breaking out between Israel and the U.S. on one side and Iran on the other. But I can tell you, with certainty from knowing the Iranians and following this for years, if Iran is attacked and if the Americans are involved in this attack, the Iranians are not just going to attack American bases in the Middle East. They're going to attack oil facilities in the Gulf region, and Iraq and UAE and Saudi Arabia especially. Probably not Qatar, but we'll see. But so the potential catastrophe is a war that knocks out a lot of the oil pumping and oil processing facilities and the ports for shipping and all. It's just hard to think about what would happen if this was ever to happen. The whole world would come to a halt for temporarily until people figure out how to stop this. So I don't think there's going to be a war because the consequences are so bad. And I think this explains why suddenly we see Trump trying to solve the stop the Yemen fighting, reach an agreement with Iran, get a ceasefire in Gaza. Who knows what else he might try to do? But he's taking these that seem to be decisive or daring steps, at least, that are unlike him. And I think the reason is some people around him probably made him understand that if we don't do anything, this isn't just tariffs with China and England. That can be resolved. This is ending the flow of energy that drives the global economy still. But that's why I don't think it'll happen. I think they will reach an agreement with Iran, and the U.S. will make a coalition of global countries that will eventually lay down the law for the Israelis and the Palestinians, say this is what's going to happen. The whole world is going to help bring this about, solve this problem. The details we don't know, and I don't think anybody knows because they have to be negotiated. But that's a kind of maybe wishful thinking on my part, but only because I say this because the alternative is so terrible to have this U.S. war with Iran. And of course, if that were to happen, it would endanger all American facilities, all American people, all across the Middle East, and probably all across the world. And if people want to slow down anti-Semitism in the U.S. and Europe, which we all want to do, this has to be addressed as well. How much of the anti-Semitism is a consequence of people's anger at what the Israelis are doing? We saw this. I think it was in the Boulder, Colorado attack. The guy said it's because of what the Israelis were doing. So this becomes very complicated because anti-Semitism was there before Israel existed. In fact, Israel was created by the Zionist movement to give the Jews of Europe a place to go to get away from the anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism in North America, which was strong in the early 20th century because the U.S. didn't want to accept Jews coming from Europe either. So you always have to go back to history for these things. And it's good you mentioned Iran, because there are these linkages. And of course, there's Turkey, which we haven't mentioned. And Turkey is one of these countries that straddles 3 or 4 different lines. It's a NATO member. It's a Muslim country. It sees itself as a leader of the Muslim world. It has on and off, hot and cold relations with Israel, and it's improving its ties with most of the Arab countries. So they're a potential big actor as well. Let me stop there. So.
I just want to add that contrary to 10 years ago, when Obama negotiated the first agreement with Iran, our Gulf petro allies, Saudi Arabia, et cetera, are now strongly in favor of a diplomatic solution with Iran, which they weren't previously. And if I had to guess, Trump is hearing from the U.S. military, don't do it. This would be militarily a disaster. And I think he's probably hearing from people who know better that this is a bad idea. So let's hope so.
So I do want to get to some business tonight. Thanks to you both. Let me take a couple of questions. We can probably go for about 10 more minutes, and then we're going to have to turn to our agenda. Noble.
Yes, just maybe not so much a question as a comment in regards to a war, quote, with Iran. I mean, just consider the U.S. and Israel, and the U.S. is obviously behind what's happening in Gaza. And after almost a year and a half, going on 2 years, they have not been able to really prevail. And Iran would be how many times greater of an adversary? And the Russians, well, how do the Russians factor into this? I mean, I don't know. That's an interesting question, I think.
Right. And if there is a war, it's not going to be just people bombing each other. It's going to be cyber attacks, infrastructure, energy, electricity. It'll aim to achieve some of the things that the Israelis have achieved in Gaza, which is to make life impossible for human beings. And this is an awful thing to consider. The fact that we're even discussing it is so frightening. But this is where we've reached, and it's not because Arabs are different or Palestinians are different. This is human nature. When people are dehumanized, they push back, they resist, they rebel. This was what drove the civil rights movement, drives the women's rights movement, all the movements for justice and equality around the world, South Africa, everywhere. People don't like to be subjugated and colonized and mistreated, and they will fight back. And some of them will fight back with military weapons. Some of them will use terrorism. This is human nature. It's happened all over the world, and we want to try to avoid repeating the cycle over and over and get to that diplomatic negotiating table, which will only happen with massive American and European and Russian and Chinese support to push the negotiating process, which I think is also something they'll probably start looking at soon.
Okay, don't see any more. So thank you very much to Rami and also to Jeff and Noble for contributing to this discussion. We're up against some pretty hard times, but it's best to know where we are. So now I'm going to take a brief transition, stop the recording temporarily.